The first thing that scared me was not seeing my pond half empty. It was hearing the water leave. I had been home less than 10 minutes when I noticed the silence behind the house. Usually, even before I reached the back porch, I could hear frogs around the cattails and the soft slap of water beneath the dock. That morning there was nothing except cicadas, a distant mower, and a steady hissing sound I could not place. My name is Ethan Cole. I am 47, and I have owned these 32 acres in North Carolina for 12 years. I know what this property sounds like after rain, during drought, and in the middle of August when the clay cracks under your boots. What I saw beyond the trees was not drought. The pond had dropped several feet. My aluminum fishing boat was tilted sideways against exposed mud. The dock stood above the remaining water like somebody had lifted the shoreline away from it. A dark, wet ring circled the bank, showing exactly where the water had been. I walked downhill, and the smell hit me first. Wet clay, decaying leaves, and that mineral smell you get when ground that has been underwater for years suddenly meets warm air. Then I heard the hiss again, louder. I followed it toward the eastern bank, where my property bordered Oak Hollow. The soil there looked wrong. Fresh, dark, disturbed. A narrow strip of crushed stone disappeared beneath newly packed dirt, and beside it I found the end of a PVC connection I had never installed. Water was moving through it fast enough that I could hear it underground. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. Shoreline, pipe, fresh soil, tire tracks, property line. Then a white sport utility vehicle rolled slowly along the Oak Hollow maintenance lane and stopped about 60 feet away. Melissa Grant stepped out. She was 53, president of the Oak Hollow Homeowners Association, and she had the same composed expression she wore whenever she explained community rules to people who had not asked for an explanation. "Ethan," she called. "I was going to contact you." I looked at the mud where 2 feet of water had been days earlier. That would have been useful before this happened. She glanced toward the pond. "We corrected a drainage issue while you were gone." For a second, I thought I had misunderstood her. "You corrected it?" "The association has been dealing with excessive saturation near the common area. Our contractor addressed the flow problem." I walked closer to the property line, but stopped on my side. "Did your contractor work on my land?" Her expression tightened. "The drainage system affects both properties." That was not an answer. I looked back toward the pond. The willow near the dock stood over bare mud, its reflection gone. Then I heard water rushing beneath my feet again. I raised my phone and photographed the fresh trench running toward Oak Hollow. "Melissa," I said, "where is my pond going?" She did not answer. And that was the moment I stopped looking at an empty pond and started looking at a trail. Melissa finally looked toward the fresh dirt instead of at me. "The contractor followed the drainage plan," she said. I had spent enough years supervising civil site work to know that sentence could mean almost anything, especially when nobody wanted to answer a simple question about a property line. I did not argue with her. I photographed the disturbed ground one more time, then walked back toward the dock. 12 years earlier, when I bought those 32 acres, Oak Hollow had barely existed beyond a cleared construction entrance and a row of survey stakes. The pond was already there, about 2 1/3 acres of dark water tucked between hardwoods and open pasture. The previous owner showed me the old concrete overflow structure on my first afternoon. During heavy rain, excess water left through that structure and followed a shallow natural swale eastward. During dry summers, the pond dropped a few inches, sometimes nearly a foot, never several feet in a matter of days. I learned its rhythms because I lived beside it. Spring rain brought muddy water and frogs loud enough to hear through an open bedroom window. By July, dragonflies hovered over the cattails. In October, fallen leaves gathered against the dock posts. Claire planted the willow near the western bank 9 years ago because she said the pond needed something graceful reflected in it. After she passed away, I kept that tree healthy without turning it into a monument. It was simply part of home. That morning, its branches hung over exposed mud with no reflection beneath them. Oak Hollow grew quickly after I moved in. First came houses, then sidewalks, then a clubhouse and landscaped common areas along my eastern boundary. For years, the relationship was ordinary. Their stormwater system handled runoff from their streets and roofs. My pond handled water from my land. The two drainage patterns eventually moved toward the same lower watershed, but that did not make them the same system. Melissa started talking about the wet ground near the Oak Hollow common lawn the previous spring. She mentioned standing water after storms and complained that landscaping crews were losing time because their equipment left ruts. Once, at the property line, she pointed toward my pond and said, "All that water has to be contributing." I told her elevation did not work according to neighborhood boundaries or assumptions. If Oak Hollow had a drainage problem, they needed an engineer to identify it. She did not appreciate the answer, but she smiled and changed the subject. Standing beside the drained pond months later, I remembered that conversation differently. I also remembered something else. About 4 weeks before my work trip, I had found 3 bright orange utility flags near the eastern swale. They were close enough to my boundary that I photographed them. 2 days later, a contractor was there with surveying equipment, checking elevations. Melissa had called it routine drainage maintenance. I had sent her an email that same afternoon. I kept my wording simple. No excavation, piping, grading, or drainage work was authorized on my parcel without my written permission. She replied that Oak Hollow was addressing its stormwater responsibilities. I still had both messages. The day before I left town, I had stood on the dock drinking coffee. The water had been less than 6 inches below the boards. 5 days later, the bottom was exposed. I looked toward the eastern bank, where fresh soil covered something that had not been there before. Melissa had called it maintenance. The pond was telling me otherwise. I did not touch the pipe. That was the first decision I made, and probably the most important one. Every instinct I had from years around construction sites told me to expose the connection and see exactly what they had installed, but the moment I moved dirt, Melissa could claim I had altered the evidence. So I left everything exactly where I found it. I spent the next hour documenting the pond from every angle. I photographed the wet stain around the shoreline, the exposed dock posts, the fresh trench, the crushed stone, and the tire impressions leading toward Oak Hollow. Then I measured the drop from the bottom of the dock to the remaining water with a tape from my truck. Just over 3 feet. That was not a normal seasonal change. Around noon, I walked back toward the eastern swale. The ground became softer as I approached the boundary, and the smell of wet clay grew stronger. I could still hear water moving beneath the fresh soil. The sound followed the same direction as the trench, east toward Oak Hollow. I stayed on my property and walked parallel to the line until the trees opened enough for me to see part of the subdivision drainage area from the county roadside. The difference was immediate. Oak Hollow's retention basin, normally a broad grassy depression with only a shallow pool after ordinary rain, was holding far more water than I remembered. The lower grass was submerged. Muddy water stood around several drainage structures. There had not been enough rain while I was away to explain what I was seeing. I checked the weather history on my phone anyway. Less than half an inch in 5 days. Then I noticed a strip of freshly disturbed ground running toward a concrete junction box near the edge of the basin. The soil was darker than everything around it, and straw had been scattered over part of the excavation. A blue inspection tag was attached near the top of the box. I zoomed in with my phone camera and photographed the number without crossing onto HOA property. That small blue tag was the first thing I found that looked less like an argument and more like a record. When I returned home, Melissa had emailed me. She wrote that Oak Hollow had completed necessary stormwater maintenance to protect common property and that any temporary change in nearby water levels should stabilize naturally. Temporary change. I read those words while looking through my kitchen window at a dock hanging over mud. I forwarded her message, my earlier warning email, and the photographs to Rachel Bennett, a property attorney I had worked with during a boundary issue several years earlier. She called me 20 minutes later. "Did you authorize any drainage connection?" she asked. "No." "Did you sign an easement?" "No." "Did anybody send you plans?" "No." She paused. "Then do not modify anything. We need the county records and a survey before we decide what this is." The next morning, I drove to the county stormwater office with the blue tag number written on a piece of paper. A clerk pulled the approved drainage documents for Oak Hollow. I spread the plan across a counter and followed the lines with my finger. Streets, catch basins, culverts, retention basin. Every drainage line shown on that sheet stayed inside the subdivision boundary. The line nearest my pond stopped before my property. I stared at that ending point for several seconds. Outside, somewhere beneath fresh North Carolina clay, I had already heard the Rayal pipe carrying water past it. The county plan gave me my first solid contradiction, but Rachel warned me not to confuse a contradiction with proof. By mid-afternoon, she had arranged for Daniel Brooks, a licensed civil engineer she trusted, to meet me at the property the following morning. Daniel arrived just after 8 in a gray pickup loaded with survey equipment, measuring rods, and enough field gear to make my own truck look empty. I showed him the pond first. He stood at the end of the dock, studied the exposed bank, and looked toward the eastern swale. "How high was the normal water line?" he asked. I pointed to the dark stain beneath the boards. He measured it, photographed it, and wrote something in a field notebook. Then I showed him the old concrete overflow structure. It had not failed. It had not collapsed. Nothing around it suggested the pond had suddenly emptied through the system that had controlled its level for years. We moved east. Daniel stopped several times to check elevations while I stayed out of his way. When we reached the fresh trench, he looked at the county plan I had printed and then at the ground. "This drawing ends before your boundary," he said. "The excavation does not." That afternoon, a survey crew working with Daniel located the recorded property corners and marked the line with temporary stakes. The fresh trench crossed it, not by inches, by enough distance that nobody could reasonably call it an uncertain boundary. Rachel immediately requested the permit history, inspection records, approved revisions, and any recorded drainage easements affecting my parcel. While she handled the paperwork, I kept documenting conditions. The pond was still losing water, although more slowly now because the level had already fallen so far. The willow roots closest to the bank were exposed. Every time I saw them, I remembered Melissa describing this as a temporary change. 2 days later, Daniel met me at my kitchen table with copies of the approved Oak Hollow drainage plan spread between us. He placed a transparent scale over the drawing and traced the system from the common area to the retention basin. Then he tapped the point nearest my land. "According to the approved plan we have, their infrastructure stops here." His finger moved several inches across the paper to my pond. "But something new exists here," Rachel called before he finished. The county had no recorded drainage easement in the materials she had reviewed that authorized Oak Hollow to install a connection on my parcel. She was still checking for amendments and other recorded instruments, but so far there was no signature from me and no approved revision showing the new line. Then she mentioned the blue inspection tag. Its number was associated with recent work near the Oak Hollow retention system, which meant the contractor had left a paperwork trail. Rachel formally requested the relevant project documents from the HOA and its council. Melissa responded that the work was lawful maintenance of existing drainage conditions and accused me of overreacting to normal stormwater management. I forwarded the message to Daniel. He replied with 6 words: "Existing conditions do not look new." The next afternoon, Rachel received part of the contractor documentation. One line in the scope caught her attention. She read it to me over the phone. "Supplemental pond relief connection." I looked through the window toward the eastern bank. That phrase did not describe repairing a ditch or clearing a clogged culvert. It described a connection. My pond was still dropping. Oak Hollow's basin was holding water, and now their own contractor paperwork had put the two ideas in the same sentence. Daniel came back the following morning to take more elevation measurements. After nearly an hour, he stood beside the fresh trench, looked from his level toward the pond, and then toward Oak Hollow. "Ethan," he said, "I think I can explain why your water did not stop at the old overflow anymore." Daniel planted the measuring rod beside the trench and pointed toward the pond. "They did not need to pump your water out," he said. "They only needed to give it a lower place to go." I looked from him to the exposed shoreline, trying to picture what he meant. He walked me back toward the old concrete overflow structure and showed me the elevation readings in his notebook. For years, that structure had controlled the normal high water level. When the pond rose above that point, excess water could leave through the established drainage path. When the water fell below it, the overflow stopped doing anything. Simple, reliable. The new connection changed that relationship. Based on Daniel's measurements, its effective outlet elevation was significantly lower than the level maintained by the old structure. "Think of 2 holes in a bucket," he said. "The lower hole determines how far the water can fall." Suddenly, the entire week made sense. Nobody had needed to park a pump beside my pond. Nobody needed tanker trucks or some elaborate operation while I was away. Once the contractor created a lower route into Oak Hollow's drainage network, Gravity did the work quietly, hour after hour. Water moved through the new connection, crossed the boundary, entered the subdivision system, and continued toward the retention basin I had seen holding far more water than usual. The hiss beneath the clay was not machinery. It was my pond trying to find the new lowest exit someone had given it. Daniel was careful about what he could prove. He wanted the full construction records before making a final engineering conclusion, but the field elevations, fresh excavation, and observed water conditions all pointed in the same direction. Rachel agreed that we needed documentation before confronting anyone further. Later that day, she received another batch of records through the HOA's attorney. The contractor's scope contained more detail than the first page we had seen. The work included installation of a supplemental connection intended to reduce persistent saturation near Oak Hollow's common lawn and improve drainage toward the retention basin. I read that sentence twice. Melissa had complained about that wet lawn months earlier. Now there was a physical connection between my pond and the system serving the same area. Rachel kept reading. There was no document in the production showing my authorization for construction on my parcel. No signed agreement. No recorded easement granting Oak Hollow the right to install that new connection. Daniel compared the contractor's sketch with the county-approved plan. The two did not match. The approved line stopped inside Oak Hollow. The contractor's sketch extended farther west, toward my property. That evening, I stood beside the willow while the last sunlight stretched across the remaining water. The pond looked smaller than I had ever seen it. Mud cracked along the upper bank where the surface had begun drying, and the aluminum boat rested at an angle several yards from the water. I could have been furious enough to grab a shovel and block the connection myself. I did not. Daniel had warned me that changing drainage without a corrective plan could create another problem and complicate the evidence. So I photographed the water line again and went inside. At 9:14 that night, Rachel forwarded me one more document. It was an email chain from before construction began. A consultant had written that off-site owner authorization should be confirmed before any connection extended beyond HOA-controlled property. Beneath that warning was Melissa's reply. She believed the existing drainage relationship was sufficient and instructed the project to proceed. I sat there staring at the screen. Until that moment, Melissa could have blamed a contractor, a misunderstanding, or a bad survey. But she had been warned about permission before the first shovel touched the ground. The email changed the question from what happened to who decided it was acceptable. Rachel told me not to contact Melissa directly, and I agreed. By then, every conversation mattered more on paper than it did across a property line. The next morning, Rachel sent a formal preservation notice to Oak Hollow, its management company, and the drainage contractor, asking them to retain emails, meeting minutes, plans, photographs, invoices, field notes, and communications connected to the project. She also requested that no additional work occur on my parcel until the disputed connection could be inspected properly. Daniel returned that afternoon and installed temporary reference markers so he could compare the original grades with the new construction. I watched from the dock while he worked. The rushing sound beneath the eastern bank had weakened. That did not reassure me. It meant the pond had fallen close enough to the new outlet elevation that gravity had less water left to move. 2 days later, Rachel called with another piece of the paper trail. Oak Hollow board minutes from 6 weeks earlier showed that the association had discussed persistent saturation around the common lawn near the clubhouse. A landscaping improvement was scheduled for the fall, including new turf, planting beds, and an expanded seating area. The board wanted the ground stabilized before that work began. Melissa had presented the drainage project as a solution. What caught my attention was what the minutes did not say. There was no vote authorizing construction on my land. Several board members appeared to believe the contractor would remain within Oak Hollow property. One note even referred to improvements to the association's existing stormwater system. Rachel found another email from a board member asking whether neighboring owner approval was necessary. Melissa responded that the contractor had reviewed existing drainage conditions and that she did not expect additional authorization to be required. That answer looked very different beside the consultant's earlier warning. On Friday morning, Oak Hollow's attorney finally contacted Rachel and proposed a joint site inspection. Daniel would attend for me. The contractor could attend for the association. A county stormwater inspector would also be invited. Until then, nobody would alter the connection. That afternoon, Melissa appeared near the property line again. She stayed on the Oak Hollow side, and I stayed on mine. For the first time since I returned, she did not sound certain. This could have been handled without attorneys, she said. I looked past her toward the subdivision. It could have been handled without digging on my property. She folded her arms. We were trying to prevent drainage damage to the neighborhood. Then the neighborhood needed a solution on land the neighborhood had permission to use. She started to answer, then stopped. I did not mention the emails. I did not mention the board minutes. There was no reason to tell her which documents Rachel already had. After Melissa left, I walked down to the old overflow structure. Daniel had placed a temporary elevation marker beside it. Farther east, another marker stood near the new connection. Two small stakes, separated by distance and several feet of elevation, explained more than all of Melissa's emails. The following Tuesday, the site inspection began at 8:30 in the morning. Daniel unfolded the approved county plan across the hood of his truck. The survey stakes marked my boundary in bright orange. The contractor representative carried his construction sketch. Rachel stood beside me with the easement search and correspondence organized in a folder. Melissa arrived with the HOA attorney and 2 board members. Then the county inspector walked to the fresh junction, looked at the approved plan, looked at the survey stakes, and asked the contractor one question. Why does the installed connection continue past the point where this approved drawing stops? The contractor representative stared at the approved drawing long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable. Then he crouched beside the junction and said the field crew had followed a supplemental sketch provided during construction. Daniel immediately unfolded the contractor sketch beside the county plan on the hood of his truck. The difference was obvious. One line stopped inside Oak Hollow. The other crossed the survey stakes and continued toward my pond. The county inspector asked who had authorized the change. The contractor representative looked toward Melissa. Melissa looked toward the HOA attorney. The association approved drainage improvements, she said. Rachel opened her folder. That is not the question. Who authorized construction on Mr. Cole's parcel? Melissa answered that the pond and the subdivision had always shared a drainage relationship. Daniel shook his head. Water eventually reaching the same watershed does not make 2 privately controlled systems interchangeable. He pointed toward the temporary elevation markers. The original overflow controlled the pond at this elevation. The new connection created a lower outlet. Once installed, gravity pulled water toward the HOA system until the pond approached that lower elevation. One of the board members, a gray-haired man named Robert Hayes, turned toward Melissa. You told us this stayed on association property. Her face tightened. I told the board the work addressed our drainage problem. Robert did not look satisfied. Rachel removed copies of the emails and placed them on the truck hood. She pointed to the consultant's warning about confirming off-site owner authorization, then to Melissa's response directing the project to proceed. Melissa read the page without touching it. We believed existing drainage conditions gave us sufficient authority, she said. Rachel's voice stayed level. Then show us the easement. Nobody moved. The county inspector asked the HOA attorney whether he had a recorded instrument authorizing the connection. He said he had not located one in the records provided to him. Rachel had already searched the relevant recorded documents and found none granting this construction right. I stood beside the truck listening to everyone discuss my pond as lines, elevations, parcels, and authorization. For a moment, I looked past them toward the willow. Its branches hung over the exposed bank, and the mud beneath it had started drying into pale cracks. Melissa noticed where I was looking. Ethan, nobody intended to damage your property. I turned back to her. Intent does not put the water back. The inspector walked the marked boundary again, photographed the junction, and documented the fresh trench. He explained that his office would review the installed work against the approved stormwater documents and determine what corrective approvals or restoration were required. Rachel added that any work on my parcel would need to be coordinated through a proper corrective plan rather than another informal decision. The HOA attorney agreed that nobody would modify the disputed section until the next steps were documented. That mattered to me. I did not want somebody showing up overnight and burying the evidence under fresh clay. Before the meeting ended, Robert asked Rachel for copies of the email chain. Melissa looked at him sharply. This is an association matter. Robert answered quietly. I am on the association board. That was the first moment I understood Melissa had another problem forming behind her. The dispute was no longer only between her and me. Her own board was beginning to ask what she had told them, what she had approved, and why a warning about permission had never reached the meeting minutes. As everyone started packing up, I looked at the two drawings still lying side by side. The county plan stopped at the boundary. The pipe did not. All the explanations in the world could not erase the distance between those two lines. 3 days after the inspection, Rachel called while I was standing beside the pond. "The county wants a corrective plan," she said. "And Oak Hollow's attorney wants to discuss resolution before this gets more expensive." I looked across the exposed shoreline. Are they removing the connection? They are finally talking about how. That distinction mattered. Daniel had already made it clear that nobody should simply cap a pipe and walk away. Changing drainage twice without engineering could create a new problem, so the correction had to restore the original conditions without sending water somewhere it was never supposed to go. Oak Hollow hired an independent engineer to review Daniel's measurements and the contractor records. A week later, their engineer reached essentially the same conclusion. The supplemental connection had created a lower discharge path from my pond into the association drainage network. The county required a revised corrective plan before work could begin. Meanwhile, Rachel negotiated the property side of the dispute. Oak Hollow agreed that no future drainage infrastructure would enter my parcel without written authorization and proper approvals. The association also agreed to cover the documented engineering, survey, restoration, and legal expenses tied directly to the unauthorized work. I did not ask for some ridiculous payout. I wanted my land restored, my pond protected, and the boundary respected. The board apparently wanted something else too. Answers from Melissa. Robert called me once, carefully avoiding anything confidential, and apologized for what had happened. He said several board members had believed the project would remain entirely inside Oak Hollow. I told him my problem was not with the families living there. Most of them probably had no idea my pond had anything to do with their wet lawn. My problem was with a decision that crossed a property line after somebody had already asked whether permission was necessary. 2 weeks later, the corrective work began under engineering supervision. I stood near the willow with Daniel while the contractor carefully exposed the disputed connection. The blue inspection tag was still attached to the junction box. I photographed it one final time before the relevant portion was removed as part of the approved correction. The trench on my parcel was restored to the designed condition. The bank was stabilized, and the drainage path was returned to the arrangement that existed before the supplemental work. Nobody celebrated. Nobody needed to. Watching that pipe come out of my ground was enough. Melissa did not attend the first day, but she appeared on the second morning with the HOA manager. She stayed near the Oak Hollow side while the engineers checked elevations. When our eyes met, she gave me a small nod. I returned it. There was nothing useful left to argue about. The measurements had already finished the argument. A few days later, Robert emailed me publicly available notice of a board leadership change. Melissa was no longer president. The notice did not accuse her of anything dramatic. It simply stated that the board had reorganized its officers following an internal review of project authorization and governance procedures. That sounded exactly right to me. Justice did not need fireworks. It needed consequences that matched what happened. The strangest part came after the equipment left. For the first time in weeks, the eastern bank was quiet. No underground hiss. No water rushing through a route that should never have existed. Just wind moving through the willow leaves and insects humming above the mud. Daniel stood beside the old concrete overflow structure and looked toward the sky. "Now you need rain," he said. I looked at the cracked shoreline. The pipe was gone, the paperwork was settled, and the boundary was respected again. But the pond was still low. Getting justice had taken documents and measurements. Getting the water back would take patience. The rain came 11 days later. I woke before sunrise to the steady tapping of drops against the bedroom window, soft at first, then heavy enough to blur the pasture beyond the glass. By breakfast, water was running through the shallow swales exactly where Daniel said it should. I pulled on my boots and walked toward the pond beneath a gray North Carolina sky. The smell of wet earth was everywhere. Rain darkened the dock boards, gathered on the willow leaves, and disappeared into cracks that had opened across the exposed shoreline. I checked the old concrete overflow structure, then the eastern bank. No hiss came from beneath the clay. No hidden current was pulling water toward Oak Hollow. Everything moved according to the original grade again. The pond did not recover overnight. Daniel had warned me it would not. It took several storms over the next 6 weeks before the water climbed high enough to float my aluminum boat again. Each rainfall erased another strip of exposed mud. The willow regained its reflection first. Then the cattails reached water again. Eventually, frogs returned to the eastern shallows, and one October morning I stepped onto the dock and saw the surface sitting only a few inches below the boards. I stood there longer than I expected. 12 years of living beside that pond had taught me that restoration rarely happens as quickly as damage. Oak Hollow changed too. The board adopted a policy requiring documented legal review before future projects could affect neighboring parcels. Robert became board president and sent me a copy of the association's updated drainage procedures. He also told me their common lawn problem had been redesigned by engineers using improvements entirely within HOA-controlled property. New grading, additional internal drainage, and changes near the retention area addressed the saturation without using my pond as somebody else's solution. That was the part one appreciated most. Their problem had always been solvable. They had simply chosen the shortcut first. Melissa remained a homeowner in Oak Hollow, but I rarely saw her. The first time we crossed paths after the pond recovered, she was walking near the common area while I was repairing a fence along my eastern pasture. She stopped several yards from the boundary. "The pond looks better," she said. I rested my gloves on the fence post. "It is back where it belongs." She nodded once and continued walking. No apology. No argument. I realized I did not need either one anymore. The survey had spoken. The engineering had spoken. The emails had spoken. Even the water had spoken, once we finally followed where it went. Months later, I was cleaning leaves from the dock when I found one of the old photographs on my phone. The image showed the aluminum boat stranded in mud, the shoreline 3 feet below normal, and the willow hanging over empty space. I almost deleted it, then decided to keep it. Not because I wanted to remember Melissa or the dispute, but because that photograph reminded me how close I had come to making the wrong first move. If I had grabbed a shovel that morning, blocked the pipe, and started shouting across the property line, I would have turned evidence into an argument. Instead, I took pictures. I found the plans. Rachel found the records. Daniel measured the elevations. The county compared what had been approved with what had actually been built. Nobody needed threats. Nobody needed revenge. We needed facts arranged in the right order. That evening, the pond reflected an orange sunset so clearly that the willow appeared twice, once above the bank and once beneath the surface. I listened for the underground rushing sound that had started everything. There was nothing. Only frogs, wind, and water resting exactly where it belonged. Justice was never the loudest thing on my property. In the end, it was the quietest.